boys and ghouls. It's me, Namakubi the Gamekeeper. And tonight's terrific tale is all about the shaky future of Sega's retro mini consoles. Lots of people want them, but there's some news they might want to consider before they get ahead of themselves. So before you lose your minds, boys and ghouls, heed the words coming from these two fine gentlemen, Mr. Yosuke Okunari of Sega and his friend Naoki Horii of M2. You see, these righteous dudes are
Oh, excuse me. Something was in my throat. You see, these two guys are currently in charge of the Mega Drive Mini 2, which is set to be released just before Halloween. Right. Well, I just got through a couple of meaty Japanese interviews with these two absolute legends of nerddom, and there's some valuable information to be found therein that sheds light not only on the Sega Genesis Mini 2, but more importantly, the future of Sega retro mini consoles in general. The two interviews are from 4gamer.net and GameWatch. They were published within a couple days of each other, and I'll have a link in the description to both for your personal edification. The 4gamer.net article by Tetsuya Inamoto has the most interesting tidbits regarding the development of the Mega Drive Mini 2. For starters, there's a statement by Yosuke Okunari that Sega originally had mysterious intentions to do something different from another Mega Drive Mini console. But then COVID happened, and there was a semiconductor shortage, and costs went up while production in factories stopped for a time. So instead of doing a new project requiring new conditions be met, they thought it would be best to do a sequel to the Mega Drive Mini, only this time highlighting both the Sega CD and the 32X. And it sounds like doing even that was a lot harder than what anyone anticipated. Right away, 32X emulation was out the door. Not because it's impossible to emulate mid-90s hardware that gave the world one of the worst Spider-Man games ever made. I mean, just wow, look at this mess. Web of Fire, more like Weeb on a tire.
Baka Gaijin.
No, it's because running the 32X was impractical on the low-cost ARM-based system-on-a-chip computers used by Sega and M2 to run their emulation software. Okunari even considered just remaking Virtual Racing XD as a full-blown port from the 32X, sidestepping the need for a fully functional 32X emulator. But cost estimates ran too high, and the thought of raising the price of the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive Mini 2 any higher was absurd, given the current $130 price point, if you count shipping. $130 is already an awful lot of cheddar for a retro mini console, especially one that doesn't come with an AC adapter.
Lame.
Indeed, this is a new industry record, so any consideration of a 32X component was abandoned. Sorta like the real 32X was abandoned after the Christmas of 1994. At least for now. Okunari did go on to express interest in releasing 32X games in the future.
But is anyone else actually interested?
Good question, dude. But Okunari does really seem to love doing these mini consoles, and I can't blame him. Imagine if this was your full-time job. But I do sort of wonder if it was really necessary to contract a specialist to develop proprietary emulators for these mini consoles, when even a schlub like me can find ways to play 32X games by alternative means. Perhaps for the sake of quality, but I don't know. It's been rough. It took M2 a long time to get their new Sega CD emulator working. They built it around the game Sylpheed, which was apparently extremely popular in Japan. And because Sylpheed is highly dependent upon perfect timing with FMV backgrounds, it is a particularly difficult game to emulate faithfully. So they began with Sylpheed, and it's taken pretty much the entire duration of the project just to get it right. I wonder how Sylpheed runs on an off-the-shelf open source emulator. Probably pretty good if you have a good PC, but then once again, these aren't top-shelf PCs that run these mini consoles. Considerations really are, to be fair, quite unique. It also sounds like M2 kept Sega on their toes by adding more and more content to the project, even beyond what Sega was asking for. For instance, Okunari wanted a remake of Space Harrier 2 with authentic super scaling in order to make the game as badass as it was supposed to be when Sega first hyped it up in the 80s. He even refers to a specific article in Beat magazine that made Space Harrier 2 seem like it was going to be amazing, but of course it wasn't. It played choppier than a weed whacker in a greenhouse. So M2's task was to go and make a brand new dream version of Space Harrier 2, which does in fact look amazing. But at the same time, they insisted on doing a full-blown port of the original Space Harrier, which they just sorta tossed onto the Mega Drive Mini 2 for like no other reason than the fact that M2 is a little crazy. Unless of course M2 is like paid by the hour or per the number of quantifiable additions that they make to the project. They could just be doing things the way my dentist likes to do them, and possibly for the same reason. M2 also decided to add these weird, really old Sega arcade games that no one remembers, Spatter and Super Locomotive. Horii says they were added by M2 simply because they had already finished working on both games for another project, and they had no place to put them until the Mega Drive Mini 2 came along. I guess they thought it would be a cool addition. M2 also seems to have pushed heavily to incorporate a demake of Puyo Puyo Sun as well, since the game's original director now works at M2. Indeed, the original goal was to incorporate a complete, brand new port of Puyo Puyo Sun onto the Mega Drive Mini, but doing so would have delayed the release of the Mega Drive Mini 2 until early 2023, and Sega had to say no. But at the very least, they managed to sneak in the two-player only versus mode from the game, which is pretty cool. At the same time that M2 struggled to squeeze in all these weird non-Mega Drive related additions, they continued to struggle with getting their Sega CD emulator to run perfectly. FMV sequences on games like Sylphid and Sonic CD wouldn't run properly, but after enough time passed, M2 somehow got everything to work just fine. But did it really have to be this hard? Maybe it did, I don't know. But M2 plainly needed time to develop a reliable Sega CD emulator to run all of these Sega CD titles. And of course, this also meant that Sega had to drastically increase the size of the flash memory from the original Genesis Mini's half a gig all the way up to 8 gigs for this new console. Because as you probably know, Sega CD data is relatively huge compared to traditional Genesis ROMs. And this additional memory, Yosuke Okunari points out, is where most of the price increase comes from. But he also hints that this high cost of flash memory is one of the main reasons why we're probably not going to see something like a Sega Saturn or Dreamcast Mini anytime soon. I can imagine a Sega Saturn Mini, if it were to have a significant library of games, say more than 20, costing closer to $200. And as Okunari and Horii mentioned in the interview, the current ARM computer used by Sega wouldn't be sufficient, if it's not even capable of running 32X games. So it might be even more expensive than what I'm guessing. But if costs get that high, then what's the point? At that price, you might as well buy a full-blown tablet computer or just get a Switch. In fact, Okunari makes the same comparison by name, pointing out that it's easy to get 32X games like Virtual Racer to run on the Nintendo Switch. The Game Watch article was a lot less meaty. However, there's a critical portion near the end where the interviewer expresses the desire to see a Sega Saturn or Dreamcast Mini in the future. Yosuke Okunari makes it clear from both articles that he does plan on collaborating with Horii and M2 again in the future, but here in Game Watch, he explicitly states that he hopes to do both a Saturn and Dreamcast Mini before he retires. But once again, he cautions that costs and technical limitations currently make that impossible. Though he adds, if people express their desires strongly enough, perhaps someday either could be a possibility. I think it's very likely that Sega and M2 will continue to work together in the future, and it sounds to me like Yosuke Okunari has plans to create a retro compilation of games from across Sega's entire catalog of consoles. However, I continue to harbor grave doubts that a Sega Saturn or Dreamcast Mini will ever be possible. The cost to both upgrade the ARM system on a chip and expand the flash memory would be far in excess of what is already a price point that surpasses what seems reasonable. However, I do think it's very possible that Sega and M2 will attempt to create a proprietary emulator that can run on pre-existing console hardware. Okunari mentioned the Switch by name, a device that already hosts a robust collection of Sega Genesis games as part of Nintendo's online service. In fact, M2 was responsible for the development of the Sega Genesis portion of the Nintendo Switch online service. So will we ever see Saturn or Dreamcast games make a comeback? I think so, but not on a dedicated device. But I'm willing to bet $130 that plans exist to add something like a virtual Sega Saturn or a virtual Dreamcast to Nintendo's online service or something like it in the future. Shoot, maybe Sega's even got plans to start their own online game streaming service. What if they intended to release their own Nintendo Switch-like device capable of accessing an online catalog or their best games in the future? Now that's an idea worth getting excited about, but it's just an idea. Anyway, there's still definite hope for at least one more physical plug-and-play console in the future if the Mega Drive Mini 2 sells well. The Sega Master System Mini. It's popular enough, it's easy to do, and it wouldn't cost very much. So, the Sega Genesis Mini 2 or the Mega Drive Mini 2, are you getting one when it comes out? What do you all think of the problem of expensive flash memory? Would you buy a Sega Saturn Mini at a price point greater than $200? How much would you be willing to pay, and what games would you need to see to do it? Let us know this and more in the comments. And thanks for watching, boys and ghouls. Oh, and in case we don't see you till then, Happy Halloween!